According to recently released data, the number of veterans experiencing homelessness declined by 11% between 2020 and 2022, and by 55% since 2010. The investments in evidence-based approaches made before and during the pandemic are working. However, on any given night, roughly 33,000 veterans across the country are still experiencing homelessness, and at least 1.4 million more are considered at risk of homelessness. The fundamental mismatch between the cost of housing and the ability to pay for it is ongoing and continues to grow. We also know that the risk of experiencing homelessness is not distributed equally across the veteran population. An individual's demographic characteristics can significantly increase their likelihood of experiencing homelessness. Black and Native American veterans have historically been overrepresented in the homeless population, while women, transgender, and gender nonconforming veterans have been more likely to be unsheltered than their male counterparts. If we want to end homelessness for veterans, we need to create a path forward that works for the most vulnerable and repairs the harmful impacts of systemic inequities and institutional racism. And that is what we'll talk about this season. My name is Cindy Borden, and I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. Welcome to Season 3 of the Road Home podcast. Before we get into this week's episode, a very special thank you.
We want to take this time to acknowledge and thank the Home Depot Foundation for sponsoring this podcast and for continuing to fund veterans housing throughout the country. For roughly a decade, the Home Depot Foundation has remained committed to supporting the mission and work of NCHV. Their continued partnership means more housing availability for veterans and hopefully one day an end to veteran homelessness. The Home Depot Foundation works to improve the homes and lives of U.S. veterans, train skilled tradespeople to fill the labor gap, and support communities impacted by natural disasters. The Foundation's Veteran Housing Grants Program awards grants to nonprofit organizations for the new construction or rehabilitation of permanent supportive housing for veterans. Since 2011, the Foundation has invested more than $375 million in veteran causes and improved more than 50,000 veteran homes and facilities. The Foundation has pledged to invest $500 million in veteran causes by 2025 and $50 million in training the next generation of skilled tradespeople through the Path to Pro program. We'll be highlighting some of their work as we talk about various affordable housing developments throughout this series. If you're developing projects that support veterans exiting homelessness or would like to learn more about how the Home Depot Foundation is making a difference and continues to serve those who serve, visit homedepotfoundation.org.
Welcome back to the Road Home podcast. In this episode, we'll be setting the stage for Season 3, which will look just a little bit different than our previous seasons. As you may remember, Season 1 explored traditional affordable housing development projects, while Season 2 focused on innovative short-term approaches, all in the effort to end veteran homelessness. This season, we're going to broaden our focus and explore housing justice as an integral piece of the effort to expand affordable housing and end veteran homelessness. In each episode, we'll use an equity lens to explore specific demographic characteristics that impact an individual's ability to have safe, accessible, and affordable housing. But first, we need to start with a common understanding of what we mean by housing justice, and that is what we'll talk about today. Some of the topics we'll cover include how housing justice is different than housing equity, the basic principles of housing justice, why the affordable housing crisis affects some demographic groups, including the BIPOC and LGBTQ+ communities more than others, and an overview of the impact of institutional racism and historical inequities on housing. We'll also look more deeply into one of the core principles of housing justice, the belief that housing is a human right. As we review the 7 components of housing as a human right, we'll discuss why this shift in perspective from housing being something that is earned to housing being a right is essential to ending veteran homelessness and all homelessness. As you can see, we have a lot to cover today. I want to thank Oliva and Antonia Fasanelli, speaking on behalf of the National Coalition for Housing Justice, or NCHJ, for sharing their time and expertise. This episode will wrap with how we can build a movement that incorporates a multi-systems approach that recognizes housing as a human right. Let's get started. Welcome to Season 3 of the Road Home Podcast. I'm thrilled today to have Oliva and Antonia Fasanelli for our first episode of the season. Can you please introduce yourselves, your name, your organization, and we'll start with Ann.
Great. Hi, Cindy. My name is Oliva, as you mentioned. I am the CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness.
And hi, Cindy, and hello, Ann. I'm Antonia Fasanelli, Executive Director at the National Homelessness Law Center.
We're thrilled to have you both here today, and you're here today in your capacity as part of the National Coalition for Housing Justice, or NCHJ. Can you tell me a little bit more about what NCHJ is?
Sure, I'd be happy to start. NCHJ is a really important group of folks who are working together to pursue housing justice because we're all representative of organizations that work on ending homelessness. And we came together sort of during a time when we felt like we had to create a more collective national voice across organizations and really figure out how to create that national voice across organizations as we really started to combat some of the more damaging policies that we saw coming out of the last administration.
Great. And what I hear you saying, housing justice, we hear a lot about equity in housing. Can you tell me what's the difference between equity and housing justice, and how is NCHJ's approach different from what we've been hearing over the past several years?
So I think the National Coalition for Housing Justice is really such a unique and extraordinary space to dig into this concept of housing justice. And to begin with, I want to emphasize that housing justice really encompasses the recognition that the lack of housing or restrictions from access to housing has caused great harm in our country and to some of the most vulnerable members of our society. And the policy positions and advocacy work of the coalition really emanate from an acknowledgement of that harm. I think housing justice for sure encompasses equity. It is an important component of housing justice, but it is so much broader than that. And I think it really it emphasizes the importance of designing policy positions by persons who have experienced homelessness themselves. It insists on a recognition of their ability to direct those policy decisions and to ultimately have power and agency over the housing that is the most critical in our society and the kind of housing that we need to have in our society.
Great. And I understand that NCHJ has some basic sort of principles of housing justice. Could you just briefly go through what those are? I think, Antonia, you've touched on a couple of them already, but what are sort of those foundational principles?
Yeah, I'm happy to walk us through that. We did a lot of work. Before I go through the principles themselves, I just want to note that we actually did quite a lot of work as a team in developing these principles because we did want to actually be different in that we are specifically talking about justice. And sometimes as a coalition, we're able to say things because we have adopted this set of values and principles that individual organizations cannot necessarily say just on their own. So I think it's important to know that context as we walk through what we mean when we say housing justice. So the first is that housing is a human right and should be universally accessible to folks, regardless of their income status or, for example, disability status or other types of things that are often make folks not be able to access affordable housing in their communities. We also really lean in on making sure that our systems and models are informed by the people who are impacted by those systems and models, right? So people with lived experience and lived expertise really should be helping to design the things that are being designed for them. We talk a lot about choice being a sort of central tenet in our work, and making sure that we are always incorporating choice into the work that we do and the systems that we're designing. And then sort of fourth, we're recognizing the legacy of racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, in our policies. We could do a whole, and I'm sure you have done, a whole show just on the legacy of racism within our housing and affordable housing systems in this country, as well as how marginalization and racism play into the systems that often feed into homelessness and housing instability. So really addressing those kinds of things is central to the work that we do. We want to make sure that our systems are adaptive and that they can be flexible enough to respond to the needs that we have today and the needs that we might have tomorrow that might be different. We prioritize healing in these systems because it is important to note that so many people who've been marginalized, especially if you're experiencing homelessness, have experienced a lot of trauma, and we have to be able to address that kind of trauma within our systems. And then the next point being really about our services have to be trauma-informed, person-centered, and based on what people want and need. And then lastly, we think that all of these items, including housing and including high-quality services, should be universally accessible, right? Available in rural areas, in tribal areas, in urban areas. And we think that that's incredibly important to building the system that we want and need in this country.
Great. Thank you so much.
Did I miss anything, Antonia?
No, I think that was a great summary, Anne. Thank you.
So the first principle that you mentioned was this idea that housing is a human right and it has to be universally acceptable. How is this idea that housing is a human right different than how we've dealt with housing historically? It seems like a pretty dramatic, profound shift in the way we look at housing in this country.
So to begin, I think it's important to summarize exactly what we mean by housing as a human right. So this is a concept that is not made up. This is something that has been adopted in UN resolutions and is a well-documented concept implemented in various countries across the globe. There are 7 main components of the human right to housing, and I'll list them right now. It starts with habitability. Housing has to be habitable, something that you can actually live and survive in. There has to be some kind of security of tenure, meaning you have to have some security to be able to remain in the home for a length of time, and some kind of protection from unlawful eviction or eviction without notice. It has to be affordable. There also has to be availability of services, whatever those services may be, for whomever is living in the housing, whatever they need to be able to continue to live in that home successfully. Fifth, the location is critical. And it's important to recognize that proximity to work, schools, medical care are often incredibly important for the location of housing. Sixth is accessibility. Housing should be accessible, particularly to persons with disabilities. And seven, there has to be a cultural adequacy to the housing. It has to be housing that recognizes the diverse cultural backgrounds that we all come from, and should provide the kind of supports that each one of the residents in the US need. When we take those 7 components and we start to put them up against the existing provision of housing in this country and the existing homeless services system, pretty quickly we start to see major gaps between the current systems and those 7 pillars of the human right to housing, right? I'll start with number 2, security of tenure. So much has been covered over the last several years, particularly during COVID, but even before, about the nature of the eviction crisis in this country. We have heard stories about eviction hearings that last fewer than 5 minutes. We have heard stories of tenants unable to raise defenses that they have to eviction. And we have read about the harm that causes, the real trauma that losing a home, particularly losing a home that you had a right to retain, can have on an individual and on a family. So we have a long way to go in terms of our eviction protections in our country. We certainly look very hard at affordability, but as we'll talk about more on this podcast, we have a major gap in the provision of affordable housing in this country. Location is something that has been a great challenge in the US. I think rooted very much in longstanding practices of housing discrimination. This is where we see a lot of not in my backyard or NIMBYism. Folks do not want affordable housing built near their own homes, which may be far more convenient to public transportation, schools, hospitals, et cetera, as I meant before. And I will note on habitability that this is such a crucial element to make sure that we have homes that are safe and healthy. We still have a long way to go in our country in providing housing that is not contaminated with lead paint, and it is a healthy atmosphere to everyone. So as I said, when you start to break it down, you see how far away we are.
Thank you so much, Antonia. So you mentioned a couple of things that we're going to try and follow up with, but I want to talk for a minute about this shortage of affordable housing that we have. It's a crisis, right? Some estimates say 7 million. We're short 7 million affordable units for extremely low income families. That doesn't include folks that are low income. And so if we think about, we have this crisis, if we can get people to agree that housing is a human right, and I think that's a big if for some parts of this population, and we can also get them to agree that there is an affordable housing crisis. Is that enough, or is that just where we start, and then what do we do next?
I think that's a great question, and the simple answer is that would be a great start, but it is not enough. There is, this. When I talked about our principles, our NCHJ principles that underlie the work that we do, one of the things that that I mentioned was this idea of healing, right? And there does have to be some healing for the people who have been historically marginalized through our housing and mainstream systems and systems like the criminal legal system, our behavioral health systems. So I think that first we all have to agree that housing is in fact a human right, and then we have to take the steps and do the hard work of realizing that particular vision, which includes funding in a very, very different way our affordable housing system in this country. Right now, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who are one of our partners in NCHJ, only 25% of the households, for example, of the households who are eligible for a housing choice voucher or a Section 8 voucher, which is rental assistance, in this country actually receive one. Waiting lists for affordable housing are often years long. So, foundationally, we actually don't have the infrastructure that we need in this country to get to that vision, if in fact we can agree on that vision. So I think that there's work to do on sort of the underlying healing that has to happen. There is work to do on the structure that has to be in place in order to support that particular goal and that particular set of values. And then we also have to talk about investing in communities, right? Right now, we have communities that have been subject to disinvestment and underinvestment all over this country. And those communities often are, majority Black and Brown people. And we have to change the way that we are investing in education and the other systems that are at play in those communities in order for us to be in a position where we're sort of preventing homelessness and housing instability, and that we have the ability to realize this idea of universal housing.
And thank you so much for that. And I just wanted to add to that. I think it's really important to emphasize that in this country, for a long time, but I think this country really doubled down on this in the 1980s. We have a housing system that is based on providing housing only to a select group of people that policymakers have decided are deserved of housing. And to the waiting list that Anne mentioned, because housing is not funded at a level to provide a home for everyone, immediately policymakers from the federal level all the way down to the local level are placed in an untenable position of having to choose who receives very limited housing resources. And that is by federal design, that untenable choice forced upon local communities is by federal design. And what the human right to housing provides to us is it pulls us out of that really untenable game and says, wait a minute, every single person needs a home to be able to survive. And that's not a controversial concept. You actually need a home to be able to live and breathe and have space to think and be able to continue your life. We know that unhoused people, particularly people who have no place to live other than on the streets, have dramatically shorter lifespans than folks who have homes. We literally need homes to survive. And so the human right to housing concept says, let's acknowledge that. Let's recognize that homelessness is actually a major health issue. It is causing increased rates of mortality, And so we need to step back and talk about how can we provide housing to everyone so that we improve the health and the lives of everyone in this country.
Thank you. I want to capture and take a step back on something both of you said. And I think, Antonia, you were talking about underfunding at the federal level, and Anne mentioned this idea of communities that have been underinvested for a long time. How did we get here? Historically, what happened that we got to this place that certain parts of our population are more marginalized and have less access to housing than than the chosen group that has housing? How did this happen?
Antonia, I feel like this is right up your alley. If you want to take the first crack, and I'd be happy to add.
Sure. So we have a long history of racist provisions of housing in this country, and federal, state, and local governments have been just as bad, if not worse, actors in that game of housing discrimination than private landowners. And the location of much of government subsidized housing by design has been in areas of concentrated poverty. It has been segregated for populations of color deliberately. We have seen this all over the country, time and time again, through much litigation. The same policy decisions have come out through that litigation process that the federal government was absolutely encouraging and or ignoring practices to continue to perpetuate housing discrimination. And so, and we continue to see this today. As I said before, this process of whittling down limited provisions of housing, limited housing vouchers to particular populations is all part of a general policy scheme that chooses some people and considers them deserving of housing versus other people. And many of these housing policies continue to this day. There's certainly a disproportionate impact on populations of color, particularly families and individuals who are Black, but all populations of color for sure have experienced this, but also LGBTQ populations, aging populations, families, women, etc. Yeah.
And I think, one, that's exactly right. And two, that, we're not even just talking about the federal and sort of national what's happened at the federal and national level. There are a whole series of state level laws and local ordinances, including zoning ordinances, how education dollars are spent both at the national level and at the local level, how clinics are cited, how schools are positioned. All of those things make up how communities are resourced, right? And those resources tend to go to the whiter, wealthier communities than to the less wealthy communities and the less white communities within states. So it's really this series of laws, ordinances, policies that start at the national level, but actually go down to the very granular level at the county, city, town, organizing, government organizing. That didn't come out very well, but you know what I mean.
So given that we have these multiple levels and multiple layers of institutionalized racism and inequities, historical inequities, how do we create a path forward for those who have been the most harmed by these policies and the most marginalized, as we look to ending homelessness for everyone? How do we create that path forward?
Well, that's exactly what the National Coalition for Housing Justice is endeavoring to do. And I will say that the first step is to ensure that folks with lived expertise are not just involved, are leading the policy decisions, and not only are given the space to be able to share their experiences, but that their recommendations on policy decisions are the ones that are followed. That what's incredibly clear, I've been doing this work for 30 some years now. What's incredibly clear is that people who have not experienced homelessness do not understand the depth of the trauma that's experienced, and therefore cannot make sufficient policy recommendations because they have not walked in the shoes of people and they have not experienced homelessness or housing instability, and should not alone be making policy decisions at all. I think there's certainly a role for folks who are policy experts to advise on where changes can be made, but the actual origin of policies to lead us towards a human right to housing and towards housing justice have to come from the people who have lived it.
I 100% agree with Antonia on that point. I also want to circle back to something that I mentioned when I was describing NCHJ. And that is, we started this particular coalition before we were even called NCHJ as in a defensive posture, but have actually evolved and moved much more into a proactive posture to really think and imagine what we are aiming at in the long run. It might not be achievable in my own career, in the time that I have left in my own career, but what we are intentionally doing and doing together alongside people with lived experience of homelessness and housing instability and these systems that we're trying to change is to create that path forward. What is it that we want in the world? And then charting a path towards that North Star, towards that long-term goal. And that work is one really hard, because it's hard for a bunch of organizations and people who have worked in these systems. I know for me, also around 30 years, to think about what's possible if we weren't constrained by the current structure, right? But also we have a lot of work to do right now as well. So we're always trying to balance out, what do we want in the long term? What do we want down the road with what has to happen right now in order for us to make incremental change? And I think the piece of that balance that is really important is that once we identify that long-term goal, what housing justice means to us, we can actually start measuring our incremental progress of around whether it's helping us make progress towards that particular North Star. So that's part of the process here that NCHJ is currently undertaking and really trying to lean in on, because we are a unique coalition that can provide that kind of long-term visioning for the field that we work in.
And it sounds like, as you're both talking, what I'm hearing is, we want to create this vision for housing justice that's new and different and works for everyone. But at the same time, we have people today who are experiencing homelessness and housing instability. And we don't want them to experience that for one more day. And so how do we achieve both that short-term crisis response, but in a way that leads us to that goal of housing justice for all? And I would imagine that sometimes those things conflict a little bit, right? The short-term crisis response versus the long-term vision.
Yeah. And I, for sure. And I agree with everything Anne just said. A lot of that tension focuses on the reality that short-term responses are often very expensive. Emergency shelter, congregate emergency shelter, which is sadly still a cornerstone of the homeless services system, is an incredibly expensive way to provide a roof over someone's head, and to move us towards the kind of housing that we were talking about in the pillars of the human right to housing is actually far less expensive, but sometimes it takes time to move the policy systems and actually build or acquire that housing. And sometimes it takes a little bit longer than setting up an emergency shelter. And I unfortunately, I think the sad result of that tension is that a lot of communities that are seeing dramatic rises in homelessness in California and New York very quickly, particularly public homelessness, are downshifting into emergency shelter, and even, as we're seeing in New York, some very, very harmful activities around destroying the temporary structures that people have created in order to protect themselves from the elements, be them tents or other kinds of temporary structures, without providing affordable housing. And we have all recently heard about Mayor Adams' efforts to involuntarily commit to mental institutions unhoused people who are continuing to reside outside. And all of those decisions in and of themselves are policy failures, but they are rooted in this ultimate policy failure, which is a failure to pivot and move to creating enough affordable housing for everyone, which is actually less costly than what they are doing right now.
So I want to thank you both. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate the time. And Antonia, do either of you have any last words that you'd like to share about this idea of how we move forward and framing for the rest of the podcast, when we're going to be looking at different aspects of an individual and their demographic characteristics that make them more susceptible to housing insecurity?
I do not, but thank you. Thank you so much for holding this. Yeah, Anne?
I think that I was trying to create something in my brain that would articulate what I'm trying to get at. And let me just try it out for you. What we're trying to get at is, with NCHJ, is some collective, using our collective power and to do some movement building. And so as you think about this entire season and the series, we can't any longer think about homelessness as a problem that needs to be solved by the homeless system. It must be a problem that is solved by multiple systems using their collective power and authority to get to and reach the principles that we started this podcast with. So as you're interviewing other folks, I think it's important sort of to tie together those pieces so that the audience can really understand that this isn't just about the homeless services system. This is really a different approach to trying to end homelessness in this country with housing justice as our end goal.
Great. Thank you both so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Cindy.
What a great conversation and start to the season. I know that was a lot to take in, so I want to briefly review a few key concepts. First, the lack of housing that is safe, accessible, and affordable has caused harm to the most vulnerable members of society. If we want to move forward, we must recognize that harm and actively work to fix it. Second, while equity is a key component of housing justice goes beyond equity to include, among other things, an emphasis on the role of people with lived experience and their ability to direct policy. Lastly, shifting our focus to establish housing as a human right requires a holistic view of housing that goes beyond simply providing 4 walls and a roof. We must strive for housing that meets the comprehensive needs of safety, security, affordability, accessibility, proximity to work, school, and other services, and cultural adequacy. You can learn more about these topics at the National Coalition for Housing Justice's website, www.nchj.org, by visiting NCHV's website and social media platforms, or by reading through the weekly one-pager. Join us next week as we explore the intersection of race, ethnicity, and housing.